Hello and welcome to this course on literary criticism. In this introductory lecture, we shall be trying to situate this course and also look at the relevance of doing literary criticism as a course in the contemporary. I shall be taking you through the course outline to give you a sense of the text that we shall be covering as part of this course and also the modes through which the discussions shall be carried forward. So, this is the bare course outline. We shall begin with Plato and Aristotle to give a sense of how the Western critical foundations were laid, and then we shall be looking at the English literary critics, because this course is primarily on English literary criticism and how those traditions helped formulate the understanding of literature and the understanding of criticism across different traditions and different cultures. And we shall be looking at English literary critics from Philip Sidney to Eliot, and this also follows the timeline of English literary history. So, it would be a good idea for you to be familiar with the history of English language and literature to give you a sense of the trends and major milestones, literary, cultural, political milestones that happen in the history of English language and literature. It will also give you how to position these various changing literary critical trends. We shall be looking at major trends. We shall be analyzing the points of departure at every point of time. If you are aware of the history of English language and literature, you know that there are these different timelines, there are these different stages through which history and literature progresses. So, there are these points of departures which become very, very significant in defining the contours of each period, of each timeline. So, we shall be looking at how literary and critical trends were formulated accordingly. We will be looking at ideological shifts which also had a bearing on the literature that was produced, and more importantly on evolving yardsticks to understand, to evaluate and to critique literature. The historical background and relevance of each period, of each critic, is something that we shall be looking at throughout this course, and this becomes all the more important to understand how the shifts were made from one period to the other, from one critical trend to the other. It will also, in addition, I believe, help us to situate the relevance of literature and the relevance of criticism in the contemporary. As you might be knowing, we have moved a long way from these foundations laid from the times of Plato and Aristotle, and there are a lot of contemporary movements, literary critical movements, that have overtaken most of the earliest trends and earliest approaches. And these shifts from an undated past to the present, it is important to make sense of it in order to appreciate the kind of writings, in order to appreciate the different approaches through which we try and understand literature and culture. These are the key figures in our discussion throughout this course. We begin with Aristotle's Poetics, after having given a background on how the Greco-Roman thoughts also laid a foundation to the formulations of Western literary and critical thought. And then we shall be looking at Philip Sidney's Apology for Poetry, Samuel Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare, Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads, and some excerpts and selections from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Matthew Arnold's selections and a few excerpts. We shall be then, in the modern times, in the early 20th century, looking at Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, and we wrap up with a discussion on F.R. Leavis. This does not necessarily mean that we are limiting our discussion to these key figures, but this provides a framework for situating this course. And this is the outline. We begin by looking at the foundations of Western literary critical thought, which has its origin, which locates its beginning from the Greco-Roman civilization onwards. So, we look at some of the important figures, some of the important texts which also become seminal in our understanding of various concepts at different points of time. And as a corollary, in order to situate the contemporariness of literary criticism and how the past also connects with the present, we shall also be giving a brief introduction to some of the recent trends that have shaped the contemporary, shaped the 20th century, such as Marxism, New Historicism, Feminism, and all such new critical movements. So, this will also help you to understand the transition into contemporary literary theory when you are doing advanced level courses on literary theory. This will also help you to bridge the gaps and formulate the connections, and also see that this is not something which is disconnected from each other, but there is a continuum. There is an almost seamless kind of continuum that you can find from one trend to the other, one approach to the other, from one period to the other. And for convenience, and largely for the sake of making sense of this course, which otherwise could be very vast and dissipated, we have divided this into 4 different modules, beginning with the classical age, where we look at the Greco-Roman influence, and we look primarily at Plato, Aristotle, and Longinus. We shall be looking at the original texts and also shall be reading them and analyzing them together. And while reading these classical texts, these texts from the Greco-Roman period, we shall also be trying to see the connections with the contemporary, how in the 20th century these texts have been looked back at and how they have formulated the various ways in which the understanding, our contemporary understanding of art, literature, culture and many things that are important to us. And then the second module, we look at a period from Renaissance to the Victorian age. Here we shall be looking at Sidney, Dryden and Johnson, who are the representatives of the Renaissance and the neoclassical period. And before that, there is a period, the Middle Ages, which have also been referred to as the Dark Ages. We shall be looking at some of the transitionary influences of those times as well. And in the Romantic period, we have Wordsworth and Coleridge, who laid the foundations of the 19th century critical thought, and they also marked a significant departure which eventually led to modernism. And then there are multiple ways in which we find that these yardsticks, they continue to be relevant even in the contemporary. From the Victorian period, we have Matthew Arnold and Walter Pater. As far as 20th century literary criticism is concerned, which also forms the third module of this course, we focus on new criticism and we look at selected texts by T.S. Eliot as well as F.R. Leavis. In the fourth module, which shall be relatively smaller in terms of content, we look at modern literary theory. We give a general background and introduction and also connect the first three segments with the fourth one. This will give you a sense of the historical sense as well as an ideological sense of how these different ages are connected together in spite of them being very different in terms of historical location, in terms of their time period. So why do we have to do literary criticism? Literary criticism is the skill of identifying what matters in a text. This is one loose definition that one could think of. This also decides which textual elements are notable. If you look at any kind of text, irrespective of the genre, we also realize that there are things which need more acute engagement. There are things which can be overlooked. So criticism gives us a kind of a filter, a tool to select what is more important, what is more notable within a text. And this also trains us to apply a critical lens to text as well as the world. This is the connection that I want you to keep in mind throughout this course. While we are looking at a text, it is not just about the bound text, it's also about the world which constitutes the text, also about the world for which the text is produced, the world which consumes this text. And in the contemporary, it has become all the more important to learn to read critically, not just with the plethora of texts that have been produced, but also the ability to read the contemporary world, the text produced in the contemporary world, the text written and also from other media. It becomes all the more important. And we also in this process learn to study the sources and conflicts and cultural tendencies which inform the present world. These are some of the aspects that we shall come back to time and again during this course, and we shall be looking at these things in greater detail. And ultimately, we do literary criticism because this is a major tool that we use for textual analysis, for discourse analysis, and it enables us to do a close, critical and comprehensive reading. These may come across as very, very simple terms, but they are very loaded as well. And in our reading, we also understand that literary criticism is one tool, one frame which enables us to read differently from others. It gives us a specialized skill to do close reading, to do critical reading and to do a comprehensive reading. This also helps us to move ahead to a new different realm of reading where we do not merely read for pleasure. We do not merely look at reading as a leisure activity, but also read with rigor and by placing it within a disciplinary understanding, within the disciplinary contours, which also demands a special kind of a training and a special kind of an understanding. This is what literary criticism does in terms of its disciplinary foundations. I read to you this quote from M.A.R. Habib. The history of literary criticism is profoundly imbricated in the history of thought in a broad range of spheres, philosophical, religious, social, economic and psychological. Part of the purpose of this book, and I add this for this course, is to place modern literary theory within a historically broader context, to view it from a perspective that might evince its connections and lines of origin, descent and reaction. I repeat the second part. Part of the purpose of this course is to place modern literary theory within a historically broader context, to view it from a perspective that might evince its connections and lines of origin, descent and reaction. So the most important word here, I understand, is context, followed by connections. So this course I hope will give you a sense of the context and connections in terms of literary theory and the critical approaches. And I also find it important to engage with one of the statements made by Len Unsworth, and he talks about the importance of having to move towards critical literacy from literacy. Mere literacy, it enables you to read, enables you to understand in the way that it gives us a superficial sense of the meaning. But critical literacy is the tool that becomes handy for us in order to approach this from within a disciplinary perspective. So critical literacy is to become aware of the cultural locatedness of practices, and this comes only from the understanding that every text is located. It is a locatedness that literary criticism and tools of literary criticism enables us to access, enables us to dissect and understand. And it also helps us to question the taken for grantedness of systematic knowledge, understanding that what appears to be the natural view of phenomena is actually a view produced by particular combinations of historical, social and political influences. So I draw your attention to these three words here about the historically broader context, the connections across and within, and also the combinations. So by getting a sense of the context, the connections and the combinations, we also learn to read texts which are located within particular cultures, within particular historical periods, and also in a larger sense within communities, within individuals, within different kinds of practices. So this is what literary criticism trains us to do. And I hope by the end of this course we shall also be more attuned, more than just understanding the historical context of how literary criticism evolved and how the different trajectories have been traced. I hope we also will be able to approach texts from these different contexts, understanding the combinations which also produce texts, and also understanding the context which not just produced texts but also produced particular readings about texts. James Seaton, in one of his recent books, which tries to trace the history of literary criticism from Plato till postmodernism, he identifies three different traditions which he also thinks are the hallmarks of contemporary literary theory. And he begins by talking about the Platonic tradition, where in the earlier period, as we would also know when we look at in greater detail Plato's writings, there was a suspicion of literature, suspicious of poems, plays and fiction, because in the Platonic view, the argument was that they reinforced the prejudices and false consciousness of the unenlightened majority. And from then, there was a move towards a Neoplatonic approach where literature was valued as a vehicle for moral and spiritual transcendence. So this was seen as something that would edify the individual, the society and the nation. And in the Aristotelian or humanistic tradition, which also became the foundation for most kinds of literature and literary readings in the later periods, then we find that there is a move, a turn towards literature to gather insight into human life. And here the departure is very, very evident. It is not just about literature or any kind of art form, moves away from all sorts of theistic perceptions, thereby also pointing out that it's not just about the knowledge about gods or for access to a higher spiritual realm, but it's solely about insight into human life, human communities and the ways in which human systems function. So James Seaton argues that in the contemporary, literary criticism needs to be understood as a continuing conversation among three traditions. One is free to agree with this or disagree from this, and there are different departures, there are different perspectives from which we can approach James Seaton's positioning of these three different traditions and the identification of the continuing conversation among these three traditions. These are some of the things that we shall be doing as part of this course. So tomorrow when we meet again, I hope you will be able to read the introduction from Peter Barry's Beginning Theory, the first 37 pages. So this you can focus on the four sections: introduction, my own stock taking, theory before theory and the transition to theory. This will help us enter the discussions on literary criticism, and after from the following section onwards we should also be following a more chronological trajectory in order to get into the readings. So tomorrow we shall be discussing Peter Barry's introduction from Beginning Theory. This will help us to situate this course as well as the text that we are trying to cover as part of this course within a historical timeline, and also see who belongs where. You will get a, I hope you'll get a better sense of it when we go through this introduction tomorrow. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, where we also discuss Peter Barry's beginning theory. Thank you.